All right, y'all, listen. I've spent the last couple of weeks really practicing and thinking about the modes, and I've reached a couple of conclusions that I will get into over the course of this next lesson. Let's do this! Hello friends and neighbors, welcome back to the Brownstone. Today we're talking about the modes, and I want to show you something that you might not have thought about regarding these scales, because there is more than one way to think about the modes. And I think in focusing on one way and not really focusing on another, some of my videos have received a little bit of criticism. Obviously, yes, there's more than one way to think about the modes. One way is to think of them as scales and play them all from the same root. That's fine. You get the sound of the mode and, you know, the harmony and the melodic characteristic of each mode by starting each mode from the same root note. But you immediately run into a problem because you've learned these 7 scales, and then the obvious question is, what the heck am I supposed to do with these 7 scales? So there's that. Caveat emptor. You can think of the modes as scales and treat them as such, but you can also think of the modes not as scales at all. I'm not trying to be pretentious about this. I'm not trying to blow your minds. All I'm saying is, if you think of each mode as a different position of the major scale, starting from each degree, then you'll get a better understanding of what goes on in a number of areas. Physically, you'll see what's happening on the neck with the scale. I'm playing the modes in C major. This is the E Phrygian mode. Here's F Lydian. Here's G Mixolydian. A Aeolian. I think I got it right this time. B Locrian, which leads me right back to C. Now, if you've seen my other videos regarding the modes, you already know how these shapes are formed on the fingerboard. And this is the way that I like to think about the modes. Maybe I'll do a whole other thing talking about each sort of melodic characteristic of the modes and how you can use them as scales over particular harmonies. I did a whole thing on Scott's bass lessons about that years ago, but I haven't really covered that on this channel. But I do recognize the fact that you can think of the modes in these two very valid and very distinct ways. But for those who are just learning the modes, I suggest that you start each mode from each consecutive note of the major scale on the same string. So if you're playing the modes in C, then you're going to play all the modes on each note of C on the A string, right? All right, now that we got that out of the way, let's go deep. So here's what I wanted to talk a little bit about today. We've all played, if you're an advanced player or an intermediate player, you've probably played this exercise where you're playing triads on each degree of the scale. But what you're essentially doing is you're also playing each triad associated with the diatonic chords of C major. Here's what I'm talking about. Here's the 1 chord. That's C major. The 2 chord, in other words, like the 2 chord of a 2-5-1 chord progression in C, is D minor. That's my 2 chord. Here's the 3 chord. The 3 chord of a 3-6-2-5 in C major. Here's my 4 chord. You get the idea, right? Here's my 5 chord. Here's Here's my 6 chord. Here's my 7 chord. And then I'm back to the 1. So now that I understand that I can access each triad of each diatonic chord of C major, then it stands to reason that I could do the same with each diatonic mode of C major, right? So if I go to D Dorian, D Dorian is a D minor scale where the 6th note of the scale is sharp. I know some folks like to play that major 6th here, that B at the 4th fret of the G string. I don't like to do that. I like to put 3 notes per string, essentially. And I've already covered this area. I want to keep moving forward. So that B for me is going to be at the, what is that? The 9th fret of the D string. Which may seem like a stretch, but you know the old pivot trick where you use the thumb to kind of swing. You get the idea. But once I've mapped out the scale, I can do the same exercise. So get the scale under your fingers. Really understand where all of those notes are going to be. And then when you play the same exercise of playing consecutive triads on that scale, you're starting with the 2 chord. So here's my D minor, the 2 chord. Here's my E minor, the 3 chord. The 4 chord, F major. The 5 chord is G major, G7. Here's my 6 chord, A minor. Here's my 7 chord, that B minor 7 flat 5. And then I'm back to C. So here's the point to all this. If I can access the triads of a diatonic chord progression using the major scale, then I should be able to access the triads of the same chord progression using each of the modes associated with that major scale. So if I've got a 2-5-1 chord progression in the key of C, my 2 chord is D minor, my 5 chord is G7, and my 1 chord, of course, is C major. Now, if I look at the triads, then let's check out the notes of each triad. My 2 chord is D minor. The triad, the notes of the triad are going to be D, the root, F, the minor 3rd, and A, the 5th. When I go to the 5 chord, I have the root G, the major 3rd is B, and the 5th, I'm going to have to go down because I'm not playing this note yet. That's a D. So I'm going to play that D at the lower octave because it's the 2nd note of my C major scale, and I'm only using 1 octave of the C major scale. That's it. I'm limiting myself to those 7 notes in that position. So the triad of my 2 chord, D, F, A. The triad of my 5 chord, G, up to B, and then down to the D. And then the triad of my 1 chord, C to E to G. So let's say I play a simple 4-note pattern that goes root, 3rd, 5th, 3rd. And those will be the quarter notes in a 4-4 sort of walking bass line. So it'll go like this. Here's my 2 chord, root, 3rd, 5th, 3rd. My 5 chord, root, 3rd, 5th, 3rd. My 1 chord, C major, root, 3rd, 5th, 3rd, root. I'll play that again. D minor, to G major, to C major. I could also play that C at the higher octave, which would make more sense melodically because it's right next to the B. I'll show you what I mean. So here's my 2 chord. Here's my 5 chord. And I'm ending on that B at the 4th fret of the G string. So I can just play the C on the higher octave. Hear that beautiful resolution? I can play the root, the third, the fifth, the third, and then back to the root. Here's where things get exciting, because I should be able to play the notes of each of those triads in my 2-5-1 chord progression on each mode of C major. So if I move down to that D minor, map out that scale, get the notes under your fingers. And then find the notes in that scale using 1 octave of that scale. Find the notes of each of those triads in the same way that you did using 1 octave of the C major scale. Now use 1 octave of D Dorian, which is essentially like, you could call this the second position of C major in a sense, because you're starting the C major scale from the second note, D, and you're ending on its octave, right? So if you remember the notes of our 2 chord, we've got D, F, A. That's the triad. So if I move down to D Dorian and find those notes, there's D at the root of the Dorian scale. There's F, the minor third of that Dorian scale, or mode. Let's call them modes. And there's A at the 5th of that mode, right? There it is on the C major. There it is on the D Dorian. So now let's look at the triad of the 5 chord. If you remember those notes, I'm just going to leave them up there for the entire lesson, right? Just so you can see them at all times. The 5 chord is G major, the G major triad. So the notes of that G major triad are G up to B, and then D is the 5th. If I move down to the Dorian mode, there's G, the 4th degree of the Dorian. Here's B at the 6th degree of the Dorian. And then there's D, the 5th, at the 8th degree, or the root. So you can either play there or going back to the root. That's our triad. And then if I go to the 1 chord, I've got C, that's the 7th note of my Dorian mode. There's E, that's my 2nd note of my Dorian mode. And then there's G again, 4th note of the Dorian mode. So if I play those triads, here's my 2 chord, here's my 5 chord, and there's my 1 chord. See how I'm getting those notes? They're all found in each mode. So as you move down the neck into each new position of the C major scale, you can access any diatonic chord progression associated with the major scale, because all the triads, all the chord tones of each chord will be found within each mode. I'll do one more and then I'll end the lesson. So if I move down to E Phrygian, the E Phrygian scale is a minor scale where the 2nd note of the scale is flat, right? So here's a minor scale. That's 1 3 4 1 3 4 1 3. Those are the fingers that I'm using across a 4 fret span. So starting on that E at the 7th fret, yes, 7th fret, 7th fret of the A string, there's my minor scale. To make that minor scale a Phrygian scale, all I have to do is take the 2nd note and make it flat. So now the shape of my scale changes ever so slightly by 1 note. So now I have 1 2 4 1, 3, 4, 1, 3. Now, check out those notes, because all of those notes can be found right here in the Phrygian scale. So here is my 2 chord. There's the root, D. There's the minor third, F. There's the 5th, A. Root, third, 5th, third. Now if I want to find the next triad, my 5 chord, the notes are G to B to D. And that is very conveniently found that's on the G major triad. I've got root up to the 3rd, up to the 5th, and back to the 3rd. And if I'm thinking about the degrees of these notes as it relates to the E Phrygian scale, and I'm starting on the 3rd of that scale, I'm moving up to the 5th, and then going up to the 7th. And then when I go to my 1 chord, I've got C, the root, up to E, the 3rd. There's G, the 5th. I can go down to this B, the 3rd as well. And then I end on the root. So if I play my little walking bass line going 1, 3, 5, 3 on D minor to G major to C major, using the notes of the E Phrygian mode, here's what that sounds like. So I'm still playing a 1, 3, 5, 3 pattern, right? Going from the root to the 3rd to the 5th. But when I went back to the 3rd, I used the other octave and then resolved. I'll play that again. Here's my 2 chord. Here's my 5 chord. Here's my 1 chord. It's all right there. And if I play them, you can hear the differences. Gonna move to Mixolydian. Check it out. I'll move up to Aeolian. Then move up to Locrian, which is the same as the major scale. And that's that. So I hope that makes things a little bit clearer as far as one way to use these modes. They are probably the most useful tool to any bass player who really wants to understand what's happening over the entire fingerboard when it relates to one key. All of the chords of a diatonic chord progression can be accessed over one major scale. And if that is the case, then all of those chords in that same chord progression can also be accessed using each mode of that major scale. So we were playing a 2-5-1 chord progression in the key of C, and then we were finding all of the triads, the notes of the triads, using not just the major scale in one octave, a 7-note range, but then one octave of each mode, finding the notes of each of those triads of the 2-5-1 from each mode. Those notes are still on the screen. Friends and neighbors, do me a huge favor and write them down. These are the triads of a 2-5-1 chord progression in the key of C. And what you're doing is you're going through and you're finding all of those triads on each mode of C major. That's the exercise. And I want to leave it there. Friends and neighbors, hey, if you like this video, you know what to do. Like, share, subscribe, donate, join the channel. All of the above is greatly appreciated from the bottom of my heart. And that's that, folks. Thanks again for visiting me here in the Brownstone, and I'll see you in the next video very soon. Peace.